Hi, everyone. I'm Ann Messenger with the Central New York Lyme and Tick-Borne Disease Alliance. And I'm here today with Judy Poltenson, who has had a tough journey with tick-borne diseases. Judy, I am so sorry about your experience, but you look great. I know you're back on your feet, and I am so grateful that you are willing to share what has gone on in your life so people can learn from it. Thanks. Tell us about it.
Glad to be here. Well, in 1969, we built a house in the woods, and we didn't have a garden or anything, so we really weren't outdoors very much. We were working and raising children. After the Labor Day storm, we lost about 80 trees, and all of a sudden, the property opened up, and we decided to become gardeners. We put in a garden. And I would go out and garden in shorts and sandals and just had a wonderful time until I didn't feel good, which was maybe 10 or 15 years later. Deer were coming and going in the property, and it wasn't a problem except that they ate a lot of the things we planted, so it was trial and error there. But I began to be tired. I couldn't spend the whole day in the garden as I had previously. And I just thought, oh, I'm getting older. And I didn't think anything about it. After a couple of years, though, I had joint pain. I had fatigue that was, it was hard to describe. I just couldn't even move anymore. I went to see my physician, my internist, and he diagnosed fibromyalgia. And for some reason or another, I just wasn't comfortable with that. He wanted to start me on a cortisone regimen, which I did not want to do. A friend of mine, whose stepdaughter had Lyme disease, had the same symptoms. And she said, it sounds like Lyme disease to me. And there's a doctor in Albany who treats people with Lyme disease. And I did go to see him. I made an appointment and went to see him, and he did some testing, which came back positive for Lyme disease and also for babesiosis, which is another tick-borne disease. And started me on an oral regimen of antibiotics, doxycycline, and I would be on it for a while and go off, and I felt fine for a while, and then the symptoms would come back, and then I'd go back on the regimen of doxycycline, oral doxycycline, and this went on for almost 3 years, and I wasn't getting any better. It was just kept recurring. The symptoms kept recurring. And finally, he decided that I needed intravenous antibiotics. And I went down to Albany once a week for 6 weeks, and that did it. Evidently, the CDC did not at that time, I don't know if they do now, did not recognize chronic Lyme disease. Mm-hmm. And with the tests are not completely accurate. This doctor treats you more on the symptoms, but also if you get a false negative test, doesn't mean that you don't have Lyme disease. It just means that there's a window. If you have the test too early, the test is really for the antibodies against Lyme disease. And if you have the test too early, the antibodies aren't there. If you have the test too late, the Lyme disease bacilli build a wall around itself, and then the test comes back negative again. So there's a very short window when the test is positive. And so people can get a lot of false negatives. Anyway, I have been off medication now for, I don't know, 5 or 7 years, and I feel just fine. However, at the time, the garden that we had enjoyed so much planting looked like a hostile environment. And so I was very reluctant to go out and garden anymore. Even we wore boots, we wore long sleeves, we wore light colored clothing, we had clothing with permethrin in it, embedded in the clothing itself. But even so, it just wasn't comfortable being out in the garden. Then we put up a fence, keep the deer out. And that worked. That and the clothing and being careful about wearing the proper clothing as we go out to work in the garden, gloves and long sleeves, light colored clothing, the permethrin. It's been a pleasure. And the positive things that have come out of this is that we just enjoy gardening, and we have a lovely garden now. We never would have put up a fence or been able to plant the things that we plant now had it not been for Lyme disease. So something positive did come out of it. The symptoms I had, I never had the bullseye rash that they talk about. I never had that. Arnie also had Lyme disease, and he had a rash all over his body, which we didn't recognize as Lyme disease either. But when it was diagnosed, which was after I had had Lyme disease, he was on a very short regimen of oral antibiotics, and that seemed to take care of it for him. But I think I must have had Lyme disease for 5 to 7 years before it was diagnosed or misdiagnosed as fibromyalgia. Sometimes they think it's rheumatoid arthritis. It could be fibromyalgia. It could be myasthenia gravis. And when none of those tests show positive, they send you to a psychiatrist because they think it's all in your mind. I don't think it's like that anymore. But back in the days when Lyme disease wasn't so well known or prevalent, that was the treatment. And now I think that there's more information about it and more people are aware of it, and certainly there's a lot of publicity, and I think the Alliance is doing wonderful things to make people aware of the precautions to take, and also the treatment is here in Syracuse now by these knowledgeable people in the Alliance.
Judy, you covered a lot of ground in 5 or 6 minutes. You talked about symptoms, you talked about, wow, your travels, everywhere from on the road to the travel, to the misdiagnoses and the treatment, and 2 diseases. I didn't realize that. And the whole sketchy test situation, which is very problematic. And you covered solutions too. So I can't thank you enough for sharing this.
Well, I hope it's helpful to some people who are listening. I think it's a terrible disease, and left untreated can be life-threatening. I mean, it really gets into every part of your body eventually. But I think we've got knowledgeable people here in town now, and makes it much more accessible to seek treatment.
We do have knowledgeable people in town. And as you and I have talked about, still a lot of people, including some doctors, don't know about Lyme and other tick-borne diseases. So I'm sure they're learning from this. I'm so glad you pushed back on that original what was a misdiagnosis. And I'm glad you had that friend who gave you a heads up. Very glad. I can't thank you enough for your time this afternoon. Really appreciate it.
Glad to do it, Anne.
Okay.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.